We're kicking off this morning a 2-week mini-series we're calling Designed for You. Last week we talked an awful lot about getting to know our community. We talked a lot about what ministry would look like in the 85205. But to do that, we've got to understand some things about ourselves. And so here's the question right from the outset all of us need to answer. The question is this: who are you? Now, just because I asked that, some of you in this room are old enough, you're having flashbacks to the 60s. You're going, who are you? Who? There's some singers in here. Some of you did that in your heads, though, right? Others of you, if I were to stop and go around and ask you, who are you, you would give me a little bit of your, about your family. Well, my name is, or I'm from Illinois, or Iowa, or Canada, or West Virginia. Nobody claims from being from West Virginia, but you know what I mean. Or you would say, many people in American culture would say, well, I am, and you would tell me what you do for a living. Because in American culture, many people define themselves by our jobs. Or take it a step further, if you have a little bit of ego, we define ourselves by the amount of money we make from our jobs, right? We have all these ways of answering this question, who are you? And we answer them, well, I'm the parent of so many kids, or I live in such and such a neighborhood, or I attend whatever church it is that you attend, or the things you go to where you're from. If you were to go home and Google that like I did when I was putting this conversation together, one of the first things that pops up is there is a whole series, like 2 or 3 pages of links of series of TED Talks on this very topic. And they answer it from the perspective of neuroscience. They answer it from the perspective of philosophy. They answer it from the perspective of what kind of personality you have. Are you an introvert? Are you an extrovert? They answer it from the perspective of how you're wired and the kind of career that's best for you. They answer it all kinds of ways. But I come back to the basic question, who are you? Because what if that really is only half of a question? What if who are you isn't the complete question? If you're following along on your outline, what if the more complete question is, who are you designed to be? We're going to take a few minutes this morning trying to understand who you are based on who you are designed to be. Fortunately, the Bible gives us that answer. This week we're talking about it from this perspective. Next week we're going to talk about it from asking you the question, what is your shape? And don't say a pear. But the Bible actually answers this question for us. Then we have the responsibility of identifying where we are within this brief understanding of who God says we are. So if you want to read along up on the screen, take a look at what Paul says in Romans. He says, because of the privilege and authority God has given me, I give each of you this warning. Pretty serious stuff if Paul's identifying a warning. He says, don't think you are better than you really are. Underline that. And then he says this, be honest in your evaluation of yourselves. Underline that. Measuring yourselves by the faith God has given us. Just as our bodies have many parts, and each part has a special function, so it is with Christ's body. We are many parts of one body, and we all belong to each other. In His grace, God has given us different gifts for doing certain things well. So if God has given you the ability to prophesy, speak out with as much faith as God has given you. If your gift is serving others, serve them well. If you are a teacher, teach well. If your gift is to encourage others, be encouraging. If it is giving, give generously. If God has given you leadership ability, take the responsibility seriously. And if you have a gift for showing kindness to others, do it gladly. Now, there's a whole lot of stuff in these 5 quick verses that we're going to break down in this short conversation we're going to have here this morning. Short, like you're going to go somewhere real soon. You're kidding yourselves. Hang with me, okay? So let's jump right in. The first thought there in your outline is this. You go back to everything that Paul says. Here's the first thing Paul tells us. Humility is key. Humility is key. Giftedness and humility, spiritual giftedness and humility go hand in hand. Now here's what I want you to understand. Humility is not this low opinion of yourself, or in the church world, this low fake opinion of yourself. You know what I mean by that? How Christians always want to put on this false humility. They go, oh, well, I'm not really that good. I'm nothing special. I just serve a great God. You're a liar. Aren't you glad you came for the encouragement? You're a liar. Paul tells us in verse 3, he says, just be honest. Just be honest in your evaluation of yourself. Another translation says, be honest in your sober judgment about yourself. And this isn't the only time Paul talks about this. Paul talks about this multiple times in multiple ways, depending on what church he's writing to and what their needs are. When Paul wrote to the church at Ephesus in Ephesians chapter 2, here's what Paul said in verse 10. For we are God's handiwork. There in your outline, underline that word handiwork. We'll come back to that in just a moment. It's really important this morning. We are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do what? Talk to me. Good works. So who created you to do good works? God did. So God created you to do God works. In fact, God prepared you in advance for the things that he wants you to do. That's what Paul was saying to us. When you take on that fakey church false humility stuff, what you're really doing is denying the greatness of God implanted in your life. That's not humility. That's stupidity. Now, why did I ask you to underline the word handiwork? Another translation that some of you maybe grew up hearing, it says, we are God's handiwork. It says, actually, we are God's workmanship. Some of you maybe are familiar with that language. Here's what the word literally means. I don't do this very often, but the word here that is literally used in the original language is the word poema, like poem with an A. It's the word poema. We are God's poema. In other words, you are God's poem. You are the tangible expression of God's love. You are God's passion poured out on paper in words. How many of you knew you were all of that? And in 1 Corinthians, Paul kind of picks up on that theme. He says, there are different kinds of gifts, but the same Spirit distributes them. And there are different kinds of service, but from the same Lord. You see, folks, here's what we have to understand when it comes to spiritual giftedness that all of us have. Humility is not going, oh, I'm nothing, I'm just dirt, I have a great God. Are you kidding me? You're God's masterpiece. God gave you a gift. How many of you, in fact, this is going to be audience participation, so let's practice. I want to make sure your elbows and shoulders work. Everybody raise your hand. Okay, now put it back down. Okay, so I know that everybody's elbows and shoulders works, and I'm going to ask you a question. I want you to answer this honestly, okay? How many of you at any point in your life have ever written a poem of any kind? A good number of you. Okay, put them down. Now, one more question. How many of you wrote that poem to someone who was the object of your affection or your passions? So you know exactly what I'm saying, right? I've written poems. I never wrote that kind per se, but I got caught up in the meaning of it. When I was in junior high school, we were in English class, we were being taught how to write poems. I didn't know that there were poems that didn't rhyme. They just don't make sense to me. But we were being taught the kind of poems that rhymed. And after the teacher had shared with us the kind of poems that rhymed and how those were written and the rhythm and all that stuff, then our homework was to write a very simple, basic poem and then turn it in the next day at class. Well, sitting right there before we ever got dismissed, I had one of those rare moments of inspiration. I've had like 3 of those in my life, and this was one of them in junior high school. And I just sat there before I ever walked out, and I wrote a poem. Mountains with ice caps, mountains with snow. Each sort of mountain has some sort of glow. Whether seen in the daytime or seen in the night, the tip of each mountain is beautifully bright. Yeah. I've only got 2 moments of inspiration rest in my life. I remember that. I think it was 7th grade. I wrote that poem. And then I'm looking at all my friends around me going, hey, I had this idea. I just wrote this real quick. What do you think? What do you think? What do you think? Because, you know, when you're in junior high, you're like really insecure, especially when you've never written poems before. But I thought it was half decent. Now, in junior high, we sat, in almost every class, we sat alphabetically. And so I sat next, in 7th and 8th grade, most of those years, I sat next to this cute little girl named Marcia Graves. Marcia was a cheerleader. She was fun. And she and I sat by each other in almost every class, so we kind of got to know each other. It's a small school. It's alphabetical. And she was one of the people I said, look at this poem. And Marcia said, oh, Harris, that's really good. I could never write anything that good. Can I have it? Well, I knew if Marcia was asking, it was probably pretty good. So I said no. I said, but here's what I'll do. I'll go home tonight and I'll write one, and you write one, and then you can use yours or the other one I write for you. Come back to school the next day, go to English class. Marcia, did you write a poem? I tried. It's not very good. Did you write one? I said, yeah, I wrote one. And I handed her the one I wrote. Now, how many of you have daughters who are or have been junior high students? So you know that junior high girls are imparted with a special kind of evil manipulation straight out of the pits of hell, right? Right? So Marcia Graves looks at this poem that I wrote her, and it didn't come to me as easily. I had to really sweat this one out. And she said, and here's what she said. Oh, Harris, this one's way too good for me. The teacher would know I never wrote this one. Can I have the other one? Now, I knew I was being played. And so I said, of course you can. Fast forward 24 hours after that, we get our poems back. The poem that I wrote, Mountains with Ice Caps, Marcia turned in, her name on it, and it got an A+. The poem that I went home and labored over and knew it was okay but not great, got a B-. I learned real quickly a bunch of things from that story. But one of them is I learned to understand the power of expression, the power of words. And to some of you sitting in this gymnasium this morning, here's what I want you to hear from me. I am so sorry. I am so sorry if you had a mom and dad who didn't understand the power of words. And in your life, when they would talk about you, especially in your more formative years, you heard the word a lot, mistake. Or you heard phrases like, you don't match up, or you're never good enough, or you're never enough. And so now as adults, when you're trying to live out that you are an expression of God's poema, that you are a masterpiece and you are gifted by Him for His purposes, you can't accept that because in your formative years, you heard all the other things. I am sorry. Because that is not the truth. It's not the truth about you, and it's not the truth about how God has wired you. You are His workmanship. You are His masterpiece. That's why there at the bottom of page 1 on your notes, one of the phrase that's really important that we're going to hang out with for a few moments this morning. In this process, respect your uniqueness. See, in verse 6, before Paul goes on to describe all of the gifts, well, this is just one rendering of the gifts, but before he goes into telling about the gifts, Paul says this, in His grace, God has given us different gifts. And then he says this phrase, and I want you to underline it there in your notes, for doing certain things well. And then he editorializes on it. He says, if God has given you the ability. Now let's just stop right there at those two phrases. It's what Paul is saying to us. Paul's saying, you have to understand that gifts and the type of gift you have don't make you better. They just make you unique. See, there's a lot of discussion going on in a Christian church today, and especially on what we call Christian television, about if you have this kind of gift, you're probably better than somebody else, or you're more insightful than somebody else, or you're more spiritual than somebody else, all that stuff. And Paul says, hey, listen up. Before I go into this gift list, here's what I want you to understand. I want you to look. I want you to have sober judgment. I want you to have an accurate understanding. You are God's masterpiece. You are God's poema, but you are not better than other people. That would be like Any of you who are parents, if you have a 10-year-old, and you throw a birthday party for your 10-year-old, and the whole bunch of your 10-year-old's friends from Sunday school and from school come, and when it comes to gift time, your 10-year-old opens up this really cool gift that you as a parent or grandparent gave that 10-year-old. And your 10-year-old opened up and looked at all the other kids and goes, see this gift? This is why I'm better than you. You'd be going, oh, what kind of monster am I raising? And that's kind of what Paul's saying to us. Paul's saying, hey, you guys, you got to stop doing that, because let's be honest, we do that. We do that. It happens. We do that when we think about people with a certain degree of intellect or a certain creativity, or somebody who has a certain earning capacity, or somebody who has a gift in leadership or administration or organization. We think that we're better than others, or we're part of the others who look around at people like that and think they're better than us, and we don't measure up. So that's why the next thought there, number 2, kind of flows out of understanding your uniqueness. And it's this one. Your gifting will become your struggle. Some of you, the greatest thing you could do this morning before you walk out of this service is stop denying the fact that you're special. Stop denying it. You're special in at least one or two areas. You know, over the years, I would occasionally hear people come up to me after a service wherever I happen to be speaking or conference I happen to be in and say, hey, great message, David, thank you. Now, earlier on, okay, I would say, oh, thanks, but you know what? I'm just an idiot that God uses from time to time. That was literally my answer. Until I understood spiritual giftedness. And it's like, no, that's not right. I'm an idiot. Make no mistake about it. But I humbly recognize that I am an idiot with a great gift. I have 2 real gifts. Teaching and leadership. There's not much else going on in here. And I recognize that my gift gets played out publicly. That my gift gets used, as a rule, on a stage where there are lights and a microphone and a camera staring at me. I recognize that. I recognize that many of you have been very kind to me in expressing that. And I appreciate your kind words. I also want you guys to understand that I love you. I love Connect Church. I love what God's doing with us here. I love where we're going. I love the incredible days that are in front of us. And if you're watching online, you want to maybe come and check us out sometime. There are phenomenal things that are about to take place in this corner of God's kingdom through this congregation. But I also know that most of you know a little bit about where I come from and a little bit about my past. And this church is very generous in allowing me to a certain number of days each year to go off and speak at other places. And when I go out and speak in other places, because of that background, I'm almost always going to churches of thousands with multiple services and speaking there. And I walk off those stages, and those people say nice things to me. They're very gracious to me. And I go and speak, and they put me in a nice hotel, and they fly me in from this part of the country. And when I leave, they hand me a check. Do you have any idea what that does to my head? That's why there are double doors back there. Because that's how it happens. And in American culture, the pride and ego that goes along with being recognized and applauded, having people across the country like you on Facebook and quote you on Twitter, even in church, even in ministry, can feed a sense of pride and ego. And while I humbly accept that God has wired me to stand in a room and do this publicly better than most, the pride and ego has been a lifelong battle for me. See, I have to work hard at that kind of stuff. And so whenever I'm out speaking, I have this little prayer ritual that I have, either sitting on the front row or back in a green room or whatever it is, or walking in a hallway, I pray this prayer. It goes something like this: oh God, I'm so grateful for this opportunity, and I'm really honored to be here to speak to these people today. And so God, here's what I want. When I walk out of here in 30 to 40 minutes, I want them to think I'm the greatest speaker they've ever heard in their lives. And then I put the caveat on it. But God, ultimately, I want them to know you. You see, it feels good to me when I have a certain degree of popularity and success. It feels good to me when people pat me on the back. And I live in this tension between accepting the fact that God has wired me a certain way that I have no say-so in, and battling what that means in the American church today. Have you been there? I don't really pray that prayer I just said. I do pray a prayer, a couple of them, depending on where I am. And I always say, God, you have wired me to do this, and I'm glad to be here, and yeah, I want to do well. I really do. But God, ultimately, I want you to speak to these people using my voice. And God, if that means that I've got to fall flat on my face, then I'll fall flat on my face. But God, just know, because of how you wired me, you're going to have to pick me up and really help me out later, because I'm going to be a mess. That's the prayer I pray. And most of the time, God will speak back to me, and he says, God, David, I made you this way, and I gave you this gift on purpose. But here's how I want you to deal with it. And then here's what God does. As I acknowledge this and I'm talking to him, God will take me back to those early days as a college student when I first started preaching. And I would go to little country churches in the hills of southern Ohio that some of my parents' friends pastored, and on a good Sunday they'd have 10 or 12 people. 15 would be like a banner day for them. And I went in there and I prepared my message as if I was preaching to 600 or 6,000. Poured my heart out. Or God would take me back to those times when I was planning a church and I was trying to exercise my leadership gifts. And there would be like 30 people show up. And we would try to get property. We'd try to do something. And it just was one deal after another. And I was struggling. I'm like, God, I thought you called me to preach. I thought you gave me a gift to teach and a gift to lead. And God, it's not happening. Know what I didn't know then, because I was genuinely putting effort into it, that there would come a day when God said, David, I'm going to use you in this mountaintop experience. I'm going to use you to speak in this situation. I'm going to use you to lead in this situation. But the way you're going to keep your pride and ego in check is you're going to remember back there when you were leading and preaching your heart out just as much, but there were only 10 or 12 people there. But if there are hundreds there or thousands there, what you're going to know is, yes, I gave you that gift, and yes, you are exercising, but the success is mine, not yours. But I don't benefit and you don't benefit from ignoring the fact that God gifted whatever gifts we have. Now, and sometimes the more familiar we get with it, the less we remember that it's a gift. For instance, if you're a teacher, like in the school system, you're probably not going to go home and spend 2 hours praying this afternoon about your lesson plan on Thursday. Why? You've been doing that same classroom for 10 years. You kind of got the curriculum down. You kind of feel confident about it. Or if you're a manager of a sales department, or if you own your own business, you're not going to go home and spend an hour and a half praying this afternoon about the staff meeting you're going to have Monday morning or Tuesday morning and about the goals that are going to be set. Why? You got this down. You've been doing it for 10 years or 15 years. You understand there's a certain comfort that goes along with that. And we deal in all those kinds of things. But here's what I understand. Sometimes in life, whatever you're good at, you're good at. But we have to be careful, because sometimes when we're good at something, we stop relying on God for it. We stop relying on him in those areas. You see, I had the same two gifts when I was 6 years old and 10 years old as I have today. Just the same two. Do you know what it's like to have those two gifts when you're 6 years old or 10 years old or 9 years old? I used to stand up in the first and second grade and make up stuff to say and show and tell just because I wanted to stand up and talk to people. You know how many times my second grade classroom saw me walk up and hold my basketball and talk about what I did with it over the weekend? Or what do you do when you're 10 years old or 12 years old or in your teenage years and you have a gift of leadership? And you don't really understand all this spiritual stuff. In fact, at that stage in life, no one's even explained it to you, at least on levels you can understand. What do you do? I look back and here's what I come to realize. My classmates and my teammates either loved me or hated me. I was either bossy or I was full of drive that made us better, depending on whether you loved me or hated me. I didn't have a filter. I didn't understand. No one broke it down the way I'm breaking it down with you this morning. What do you do when you have those same kinds of things? And then I got older and I started studying spiritual gifts and I felt a call to ministry and like, really? There's a job where they pay you to do those two things? Mom and Dad, this whole area about giftedness and uniqueness and struggle, if you got a child or a grandchild and they're displaying some behaviors that are somewhat unique, and you've got this kid that sometimes struggles and sometimes you don't understand and are wired a little bit differently, here's what I would encourage you to do. Find their uniqueness, because what you're seeing and calling unique might be actually a hardwiring from God and they just haven't grown into it yet. And nurture it within them. Nurture that within them. It just needs time to develop. It just needs time to mature. That's why I go back to verse number 3. Paul says, I give you this warning. Don't think you are better than anyone else, but be honest in your evaluation, or be of sober judgment, measuring yourselves by the faith that God has given us. And then our final thought, number 3 down there. You are designed to be God's gift to others. Now, some of you already know that. Some of you, when you were teenagers, guys, you had somebody look at you and say, who do you think you are? God's gift to women? You already know you're God's gift to others, right? Some of you already think that you're God's gift to the business community or to the athletic community. This isn't catching you off guard. We're just going to put a little perspective around it. You're designed to be God's gift to others. Let me ask you this question, knowing that your elbows and shoulders work. How many of you, by show of hands, how many of you chose where you were born? Well, let me ask you this. How many of you chose your level of IQ? Well, I'm over. Okay. How many of you chose your personality? How many of you chose your Myers-Briggs assessment? You know, introvert, extrovert, thinker, feeler, all that stuff, intuitive. Okay, well, let me ask an easy one then. How many of you chose your parents? And you know what? You chose none of those things. And in the same kind of way, God didn't ask you, and God didn't ask me, what gifts do you want? When God decided to stork you down to heaven, from heaven down to earth, God didn't say, do you want this kind of gift? And I went, no, God, I want the leadership gift. Didn't happen. I had no say-so in my spiritual giftedness. You have no say-so in your spiritual giftedness. And yet all of us have giftedness. Why? Because God has a plan, God has a purpose, not just for you and me, but for all of humankind, for all of eternity. And God said, I'm going to hardwire Vicky like this because there will be a void on earth if she doesn't do that. I'm going to hardwire George like this. I'm going to hardwire Ron like this. And I'm going to hardwire Gene like this. I'm going to hardwire Marilyn like this. I'm going to hardwire Steve like this. And God says, I'm going to do that for my purposes, and I'm going to give you the process of understanding and utilizing and implementing them in your life for His glory. All of us have that. Romans chapter 12, verse 5, in the early parts of our verses, but I repeat it there. It says, "You're God's gift to others. So it is with Christ's body. We are many parts of one body," and then here it is, "and we all belong to each other." Means there are 7 billion people on earth with gifts to serve God's purpose, and we're to do that by serving each other. 1 Peter 4:10, Peter says the same kinds of things Paul's been saying. Each of you should use whatever gift you have received for what purpose? To serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various form. Now in verses 6 through 8, Paul starts laying out some of the gifts. He talks about prophecy. He talks about leadership. He talks about teaching and serving and giving. Now that's not an exhaustive list. As a matter of fact, in the New Testament, there are 4 such different lists according to whoever Paul or Peter or the different guys were writing to. We don't have time to go into all of that now. That's why in a couple of weeks, it's there in your worship folder, we're doing our spiritual gifts class 202. And not this Saturday, but the next, March the 2nd, I believe it is, we're going to be offering this class. This is background material. You can pick it up at the table out there by the door on your way out. You can sign up for that class, or you can even do it online. I think Kyle has put something on our website where you can go online. But this is a pretty comprehensive listing of all the gifts. I think there's here 31 or 33 different gifts. Some of them you wouldn't even know were gifts, like helps and wisdom and healing and giving and all that stuff. It's all in here. I would encourage you to pick this up, take it home, find yourself. You'll usually see yourself in at least 2 of them, maybe a little bit of a third one. I'd also encourage you to sign up for our class. I'm going to be teaching. We're going to do it from 9 to 11 on March the 2nd. But grab this. I don't have time to cover all this today or next week, but we're going to spend some time doing that in that class. It's important that we all understand what our spiritual gifts is. Because whatever you have been given, whatever gift it is, God gave you that gift because you have a role to play in God's plan. And your gift is not just for you. And this isn't in your notes, but I think you've got some room there in the margins to write it. There's an author and pastor in Central California by the name of David Guzik. And David Guzik says, here's something really important when it comes to spiritual gifts we have to understand. Spiritual giftedness does not equal spiritual maturity. Spiritual giftedness does not equal spiritual maturity. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. I can remember having the privilege of growing up with going to all these summer Christian camps, and you go to those big evangelistic services every night. Some of you know what I'm talking about. Altars lined, dozens and dozens of people just pouring their hearts out. But I can remember walking out. I was 10, 12, 14 years old, pretty much a good bit of my life. And I would walk back from those big tabernacles with hundreds or thousands of people in there, and I'd walk back to my dorm or my parents' camper. And I would remember thinking, I will never have the level of spiritual confidence that those men in black suits who sit on those platforms have. Had no interest, had no idea I'd ever be in ministry. I was just talking about strictly from a spiritual perspective. Thinking those men must be so close to God to stand up there and do what they do, and those women say what they say, and all of that stuff. Until I got older and realized spiritual giftedness doesn't equal spiritual maturity. I am personally very humbled whenever I encounter people who have the spiritual gift of giving. I have some friends and acquaintances who are wealthy and have the spiritual gift of giving. And I have some friends and acquaintances who are on the poorer side of life who have the spiritual gift of giving. And every time I'm around them, I am incredibly humbled. And I think about my life and the fact that what I do is a little bit more public than some of the other gifts, but then I think about how that benefits the whole kingdom, or at least our whole church community, because personally, I benefit from those of you who are sitting in this room this morning who have the spiritual gift of encouragement, because my leadership gift requires me to carry certain burdens, and it's your encouragement that gives me the strength to go on carrying some of those burdens. People see me, they don't see you, but I benefit from you. You all see David the speaker and David the leader, and You never see the encouragers who keep me going. You never see the people who have wisdom who pour into me behind the scenes. You never see the people who have faith or the gift of faith or praying or healing who pray with me and strengthen me. Yesterday we benefited from some people in this room who have incredible gifts of hospitality and helps. We don't even recognize the people around here who have the spiritual gift of martyrdom. They're the ones that serve on our security team. But here's what's interesting. In this passage that we studied in Romans, Paul compared the church body to the physical body, right? Now here's what I know about the physical body. In the physical body are the most vital, the most crucial organs, those that are seen or not seen. Not seen. In other words, the public ones, they get the recognition, but it's the vital ones that nobody sees. You know, I like having all my fingers, but if I lose a finger or two, my life's probably not in jeopardy. But if I were happen to lose a lung or a liver or my heart, it's a different conversation, right? See, when I think about our church, let's just get real. I'm not the only one. There are others of you, but I'm speaking, so I'm the example. Most of what I do is more public. A couple others of you have more public type stuff. But the strength of our church and the promise of our future isn't in me. It's in all of us who are part of the body that have the organs that are unseen. Those of you with the gifts of wisdom, the gifts of giving, the gifts of help, the gifts of mercy. See, I get to do what I do at a certain level because we have people like Tori Clinton and David Yanez and Gene Pallone who go off and visit the people who are sick and the people who are in the hospitals. So I have time to study. So I have time to sit in meetings and do planning. It's all of us doing our part. Just because a gift is one that's more seen doesn't mean it's more spiritual. And it doesn't mean it's more spiritually mature. See, some of you want to fit in here. You want to work and help out around here, but you don't know where you fit. That's why we're doing the 202 class. So that you can serve others who are already in this room. And you can serve others who are not yet in this room and are going to be in the months ahead. So here's the question every one of us has to answer this morning, or at least begin answering this morning for ourselves. You have to ask yourself this question. What role do you play in God's plan in God's kingdom? What role do you play in God's plan in God's kingdom? Let me phrase it a different way. If you were taken from this earth today, what void would be left for someone else to fill in this body? See, folks, as a congregation, we have an incredible future in front of us. And because Connect Church has an incredible future, that means the city of Mesa has an incredible future. But it takes all of us using our giftedness in service for the benefit of whom? Others. That's why God gifted us. Every one of us has a gift or two that God plans to use for his purposes. And it takes all of us coming together, doing our part. I benefit the most in my life when both of my lungs are breathing in and breathing out. When my heart is beating at a certain rate. When my hearing is at a certain level. When my mobility and flexibility is at a certain level of endurance. So too does the body of Christ. So too does the body of Christ known as the Fellowship of Connect Church benefit when all of us are working and serving together. And the people who have the gifts of administration are administering. And the people who have the gifts of mercy are mercying. And the people who have the gift of helps are helping. And the people who have the gifts of giving are giving. The people who have the gifts of leading are leading. The people who have the gifts of healing are healing. And the people who have the gifts of wisdom are wising and all that good stuff. All of us working together as one body for the benefit of everybody else. And so, Father, who are you or who am I designed to be? I've answered that question for myself in a very public fashion. Now everybody else in this room has to answer it for him or herself. The answer's in there. We are who you designed us to be according to your plan and your purpose. And when we get outside of that plan and outside of that purpose, typically that's when life gets most frustrating. That's when we get most burned out, most tired. That's when certain struggles come in. And God, I was very transparent about my struggles throughout the better part of my life based on living out the giftedness. Because the enemy loves nothing better than to begin to pick and peck and tear apart. And he will frequently use our greatest gifts against us. So in my case, sometimes that's pride and ego. But years ago, when I wasn't even thinking about it, you already built into me the level of understanding what humility looks like. It's still a battle. I publicly confess that. But it's a battle I'm aware of. And so God, for some of these people in here, whether they have the gift of administration or healing or wisdom or mercy or giving or praying, whatever the case may be in the 30-some gifts that we'll go over in a couple of weeks. Whatever their struggle is in acknowledging that gift or implementing that gift or accepting that gift, we pray, God, that you would minister to them, that you would speak into their lives, and that you would begin to knit us together very deeply, very fully, for purposes greater than our own. God, we love you. We thank you with all goodness. In Jesus' name, amen.